Hello, my name is Jordan Tobias, and I'm going to be talking to you about Regina Krahl's article, Famous Brands and Counterfeits Problems of Terminology and Classification in Song Ceramics. To start off with, here's a little bit of background of the author Regina Krahl. Krahl is a specialist in ancient Chinese ceramics and is a scholar on the topic and has written multiple different things on the subject matter. Additionally, for a period of time, she served as the president of the Oriental Ceramic Society. So all this gives her plenty of background to write on the topic of Song Dynasty ceramics. That is the focus of the essay, making this from a background that is well researched and reliable because she is an expert in the field. So the main arguments in this essay surround this idea of branding. So basically, the essay is primarily about how in Song China there were these ancient names for different types of ceramics that sort of acted like brands. It was oftentimes different kilns which the ceramics were produced from, but it's not just the kilns, and there's other geographic and even other socio-economic different distinctions for these different brandings. And Krahl argues that this idea of branding is ultimately detrimental for multiple different reasons. Krahl discusses how once brands are created and these ideas are formed, it leads to the idea of counterfeits. So ceramics that aren't made from a specific kiln, but are in that style of stuff produced under that brand would be a counterfeit of it and then be considered less valuable because they're a counterfeit, not an original. But that isn't necessarily true. And additionally, the geographic classification that was used to create and distinguish all these brands isn't actually always accurate. And ultimately, and all in all, the system is more detrimental than it is beneficial. So, Krahl's main methodology of going about creating this argument is she discusses the historical context to these classifications and looks at primary sources like the writings of poets like Lu Yu, who was one of the first people to actually distinguish ceramics based off of the manufacturer. And Lu Yu often wrote about these different kinds of brands and came up with names for a few and gave them various different characteristics and distinguishing factors to them. And through this different research and historical background, Krahl identifies 10 different of what she refers to as the ancient names of Song ceramics. And then the essay as a whole isn't just structured as a block of text, it's actually broken up into 10 different sections discussing each of these brands. And in each of these subheading sections, Krauss goes through and breaks it down in three parts. She first discusses in theory and the theoretical distinctions of the classification of each brand. Then she goes on to state the problems in practice and why these classifications are not always the most accurate and not necessarily the most beneficial to use in classification of Song ceramics. And then Krahl goes on to make a concluding statement about each of these brands and does it these 10 times. And due to this structure, while it makes the essay very easy to follow, it does in fact make the breakdown and the summary of the essay a little bit more difficult to do. So in this presentation, instead of breaking down and discussing each of these 10 different brands, because Krahl has already broken it down, I'll first list all the 10 terminology that she used to define these different brands, and then I'll point out some of the major aspects that she found to be problematic about these classifications. Additionally, because of the nature of the essay being more analytical and kind of definitional, referring to these different terminology, there isn't that many photos that she used in the essay, and therefore not many photos that I'm using in this presentation, especially because one of the major issues that are brought up by this research is how these classification can get a little bit tricky. Therefore, I did not want to misidentify any pieces in this presentation. So to go on, there wasn't any terminology in the essay that I found very difficult to understand, and overall, Krahl's writing was very understandable for a reader who would have limited prior knowledge, because the main terminology that was unfamiliar to me at least was the terms used to define the 10 different types of ceramics. And then again, she goes on to explain in depth each one, so it was still very easy to understand. And the different brands and names of the song ceramics that she identifies are as follows. Most of these are regionals, kilns, and other geographic distinctions, but that is not always true. But this is what Krahl identified through different historical and ancient writing on the subject, and this is what was commonly used at the time as distinctions for these ceramics. So, one of the major problems that she listed in these classifications by using these brands is a lot of them are not very well defined. This includes the Jun brand, which isn't mentioned in any Pring text, therefore, it wasn't actually used as terminology in the Song Dynasty. So, the classifications of Jun is very vague and was never really well defined. So sometimes things are being used to classify this way, and other times pieces with similar characteristics are not being classified the same way. And additionally, other terms that were never really used as word includes the raujo, which was known as one of the most common of song wares. However, this ancient word was never actually popularized as the brand name, and wares of this distinction were oftentimes just referred to as physical descriptions and the characteristics of the pieces. So while this is one of the 10 types, it was never a word that was actually used during the time. Another brand that was more difficult to define is the Ruware, where there's debate about what period it actually covers. So there's some difficulty in classification of pieces in that regard due to the time period. And the Longquan brand covers a very large geographical region, and there's a lot of overlap with counterfeit pieces coming from this region and vice versa. That again makes it very difficult to use as classification, and Krahl critiques this use of classification because of the vagueness in the definition of this brand type. So another reason that Krahl critiqued use of branding is that some of them just were not specific enough. In addition to just not being well defined, the seiju was used for all northern white wear, which was oftentimes confused with dingware, which was also northern characteristic of northern white wear with very fine forms. So this was a lot of overlap with between those two brands because of the lack of specifications when it comes to these characterizations. And the Zhejiang was a large spectrum of wares that this classification covers. And again, it was copying other techniques such as Johnware. And there's a lot of difficulty in pinning down the classifications there. However, with Johnware, that is the one type and brand that Krahl identifies as the least problematic, because most of the pieces coming out of those kilns were these very distinct small black bowls with the hare's fur brush strokes in it and this black glazing. But the difficulty comes when other kiln sites were copying after them. Another difficulty in the classification and critique there is not all these terms were even geographical and based on the kilns. This includes guan, which is the word for official, yet these pieces were actually just made for the capital, and this doesn't reflect on a geographic region, as well as the gagware, which is a connoisseur's term. And Krahl even goes on to state that pieces were labeled as gaware in a way that the terminology was being used at random. And oftentimes, guan and ga as classifications were used interchangeably. And I did show an example of gaware, which is very distinct with this like white glazing with lots of cracking through it. But again, it's very difficult to distinguish that type of ware with the guanware, as they were both from similar regions and for a similar purpose. But again, neither of them were quite geographically based, not named after kilns, just kind of after these purposes, which again makes classification even more tricky, and is one of the other reasons that Kyle states that the classification isn't necessarily the best system for going about defining these pieces. And ultimately, looking at my critique on her work, I find that this essay overall was a very interesting argument. Logically, it makes a lot of sense and it flows really easily. My one critique with Krahl's essay is that she does not provide an alternative classification system. She critiques the way of that the current classification is, yet we still use the classification and it helps with the discussion of it. The only thing that she suggests is that perhaps we don't need classification at all, just because it overcomplicates the system because there's already this lack of definition with the classification. But it would just be more understanding for me as a reader if she provided clearer alternatives to this current classification system or the way of going about and studying these pieces, since she makes it very clear that the current classification system and using these terminologies and viewing the kilns like brands has some very definite problems with that. And that's my sources. Thank you for watching.